Hey guys, I'm Tony, your host of the Green Blog Podcast and a Stranger Things podcast. If you guys haven't heard about the Anchor app, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. All you have to do is just go download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. I can't wait to hear your podcast.
Chief.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, look better than your wife when I left her this morning.
While you were drinking or sleeping or whatever it is you deem so necessary on Monday morning, Phil Larson called, said some kids are stealing the gnomes out of his garden again.
Oh, those garden gnomes again. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to get right on that.
On a more pressing matter, Joyce Byers can't find her son this morning.
Okay, I'm going to get on that. Just give me a minute.
Joyce is very upset.
Flo, we've discussed this. Mornings are for coffee and contemplation.
Chief, she's...
Coffee and contemplation. Flo.
Chapter 5. Childhood. There's something about the moment in Season 1, Chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers, when the kids are leaving the house. It's night. They've just finished playing Dungeons & Dragons in Mike's basement. The shimmering synth soundtrack kicks in. The Kyle Dixon and Michael Stein composition, Kids. They get on their bikes with homemade flashlights, and they ride off together into the dark suburban streets. No helmets, no parents, just kids. You practically feel the cool night air as they bike through the neighborhood. That rush, the elation, that freedom. That's the first thing that comes to mind for many who grew up as kids in the 1980s. Freedom. Riding bikes to school without parent supervision, riding to friends' house without parent supervision, going to the mall or to the playground or pool, maybe even the cemetery at night without parent supervision. Sure, we check in now and then. Most kids had curfews, although it was common to sneak out at night. But there were hours each day that belonged to us. We explored. We did things we shouldn't. We operated off radar. Adults had their own lives. We had ours. This is not just nostalgia. Studies back it up. In the 1980s, over 70% of kids walked or biked to school without parent supervision, many as early as kindergarten. Today, that number is under 10%. There was no pickup protocol at most schools. When school was dismissed, kids went where they went. The idea seems bizarre by today's standards, but pick any activity, going to the playground, to baseball practice, to the movie theater, and more kids by far were doing it without supervision in the 1980s than they are today. Many millennials and Gen Zers love Stranger Things precisely because of this unconstructed, unsupervised version of childhood it represents. Asked about what felt different about going back to that time period as an actor, Millie Bobby Brown, 11, responded, "I think it was the freedom, because they had so much freedom back then, and I'm very limited in my freedom now, because I can't go outside without my mom literally standing right beside me." Millie is not alone. Millennials and Gen Zers statistically are far more closely supervised than their predecessors. They are much more likely to be dropped off and picked up from activities. They are much likely to hang out at each other's houses on a whim. Their locations and movements are often tracked via smartphones, smartwatches, or other devices. Parents almost always know exactly where their kids are. That wasn't the case in the 1980s. The world recreated for us in Stranger Things. According to the Duffers, the show simply wouldn't have worked if it was set in the present because it depends on that childhood freedom and mystery. "We grew up without cell phones," explains Ross Duffer. "I don't know what it's like growing up now, but when we were kids, you'd go outside, you'd go into the woods behind your house, and your parents couldn't contact you. They don't know where you were. There was this sense of, what if we find a treasure map out there and mobsters were after us, and we'd find a ship with gold? It feels like that now. Your mom texts you that it's time for dinner. It might just take you right out of that." Kids in the 1980s, untethered by cell phones, blocked out schedules, and helicopter parents, were free to move about suburbs and cities alike with remarkable latitude. Of course, it's easy to romanticize the past. Some may view such laxity by today's standards as neglect, perhaps even irresponsible and dangerous. Even at the time, there were growing concerns. Some kids resented their parents' lack of attention. The culture at large was anxious about changing family dynamics. Divorce and single-parent homes were on the rise, as were the amount of families with two working parents, leading to a generation of so-called latchkey kids, a term applied to children who returned from school to empty houses because parents were still at work. The 1980s also marked the beginning of a national panic about child abduction, which is in many ways responsible for the massive sea change that has led us to where we are today. Which is to say that even in the 1980s, people weren't in agreement about how children were growing up or how parents were parenting. But it is this period-specific iteration of childhood and its percolating tensions between freedom and fear that is represented so authentically in Stranger Things. Bikes. Perhaps the ultimate symbol of childhood freedom from the 1980s is the bike. The bike allowed kids mobility. Not only could they go places, they could get there relatively fast and without depending on adults. In this way, a bike offered children a sense of control and empowerment. It gave them an early sense of being able to navigate and explore the world on their own. As in many other classic 80s movies, E.T., The Goonies, bikes play a crucial role in Stranger Things. Bikes, notes television critic Glenn Walden, allow kids to slip between the cracks and explore on their own, away from adult attention. So important are they to this form of storytelling that the discovery of one's abandonment of bike is the trigger that first alerts Stranger Things chief sheriff that something isn't right. Indeed, when Chief Hopper finds Will's bike in the woods in Season 1, Chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers, he can't imagine Will not bringing it home under normal circumstances. A bike like this is like a Cadillac to these kids, he tells his deputies. Hopper's remark highlights the significance of the bike to a child in the 1980s, especially a BMX bike like Will's. The popularity of the BMX bike exploded in the 1980s, an outgrowth of the 1970s dirt bike scene in Southern California. BMXs soon became in really a huge part in youth culture. Unlike most bikes for kids before them, they were stylized and tough, intended for stunts and off-road driving. They were also easy to customize. Freestyle BMX biking reached its peak of popularity in the mid-1980s. Not only were they featured in major blockbuster films like E.T., they were also the inspiration for movies like BMX Bandits 1983 and Rad 1986. BMX bikes were synonymous with cool. Owning one became an extension of a kid's identity, much like Nike's would later in the decade. Prop master Linda Rice went to great lengths to find the right bikes for the boys in Stranger Things. She needed 16 bikes in all, one primary, one backup, one stunt bike, and one backup stunt bike for each kid. Since it was difficult to find that many bikes of the same style, Rice went with a mixture of banana seat bikes and BMX bikes. Mike's bike is actually a reproduction, Rice says. We aged them all up and taped them. With Dustin's bike, we decided he was sort of a klutz, so we painted his bike but never finished it, and that's why his bike has two colors. Those bikes make an appearance in just about every episode of Stranger Things. Perhaps the most memorable scene, however, comes in Season 1, Chapter 7, The Bath. The episode opens as Mike and Eleven are having a moment, just as they seem to be about to kiss for the first time. However, Dustin suddenly barges in the room, shouting that Lucas is in trouble. Though a weak, muffled signal on the walkie-talkie, he warns that the bad men are coming. They need to leave now. The kids run upstairs, look out the window, and discover that, sure enough, the Wheeler house is surrounded by white vans labeled Hawkins Power and Light. Mike tries to get information from his mom. Did she call about repairs? But she's on the phone too, preoccupied to understand the urgency of the question. If anyone asks where I am, Mike declares to his baffled mom, I've left the country. With that, he bolts outside the side door with Eleven and Dustin, where the bikes lie waiting for their great escape. As the kids run their bikes across the lawn, they are spotted by agents from Hawkins' lab, including Dr. Brenner. Go, 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 Dustin yells. Eleven hops on the bike of Mike's banana seat, Dustin on his painted bike. The kids begin navigating an intricate suburban grid of secret pathways, backyards, and side alleys, trying to elude the white vans, coordinating via walkie-talkies. They eventually meet up with Lucas, assuming they have lost the Hawkins lab agents. Just when they think they are safe, however, they see the white van again, and the chase resumes. The chase is undoubtedly the best cinematic bike sequence since E.T. Indeed, in many ways, it is a direct homage to the famous scene from Spielberg's film. The Duffer Brothers told Entertainment Weekly that they originally did not have a bike chase planned for this season, fearing it would be viewed as derivative. "We tried to resist the impulse. We honestly did," they acknowledge. "But we're only human." Thankfully, they gave in. Not only is the bike chase among the most exciting 5 minutes of the season, it also created one of the show's most iconic moments. Everyone remembers the famous moment in E.T. when the kids are on the bike seemingly trapped by a blockade of police cars, suddenly fly over the top, as John Williams' score makes the audience feel every ounce of their surprise and elation. Stranger Things clearly and cleverly draws on and inverts this moment. As in E.T., the kids manage to elude the lab agents before finding themselves trapped on both sides. Just as the van in front of them is closing in, Eleven lowers her head and flips it with her mind. Instead of the kids flying over the blockade, the van goes airborne. We see this incredible moment from 3 different angles. First, from straight on, making it feel as if the van is heading directly at the audience, then from the side in slow motion, capturing the sense of shock and awe as the van suddenly elevates above them, and finally looking down from above, showing the kids' stunned expressions as the vehicle flips over their heads. As the van crashes down behind them, obstructing the other vehicles, the kids keep riding, looking back as if to confirm that what just happened. The Hawkins lab agents seem equally astounded, including Dr. Brenner, who seems more impressed than angry. Bikes, then, are not only a symbol of childhood freedom, they allow the kids to elude danger and outmaneuver adults with a little help from Eleven's superpowers, of course. Fittingly, the cover art for Stranger Things features Lucas, Dustin, and Mike on their bikes. Netflix commissioned British artist Kyle Lambert to paint the very 80s-esque photorealistic character collage. Lambert was inspired by the poster of Drew Struzan, who created the famous covers for the Star Wars trilogy and Blade Runner. Lambert wanted the Stranger Things poster, like the posters from those classics, to tell a story, to capture the characters' symbols and motifs that mattered most to the series. Right in the center of that collage is the ultimate emblem of childhood in the 1980s, kids on bikes. Missing children. Incidentally, when the Duffer Brothers originally pitched Stranger Things, they also featured the bike as the central image. In this early phase, not an elaborate collage, but a simple, stripped-down image of Will's abandoned bike. We literally took the Firestarter paperback, Stephen King's 1980 novel, and pasted a picture of a bike on top of it and changed the font to our font, recalls Matt Duffer. That more minimalist focus on the abandoned bike points to one of the show's other main point plots and themes, the fear of a disappearing child. The 1980s gave rise to a national panic about childhood safety and stranger danger that transformed American culture. This panic began with a handful of high-profile disappearances. In 1979, Ethan Patz, a 6-year-old boy from New York, was kidnapped on his way to school. His mysterious disappearance riveted the public, and with the efforts of his father, a professional photographer with media connections, quickly turned into a local and then national media frenzy. Other high-profile cases followed. In 1981, Adam Walsh, son of John Walsh, who later became the famed host of America's Most Wanted, was kidnapped at a Sears in Florida. It was subsequently discovered that he was murdered. His story remained an enormous amount and received an enormous amount of press and was eventually turned into a made-for-TV movie in 1983. The early 1980s also saw terror in Atlanta, or Atlanta child murders, in which dozens of kids, mostly black boys from inner city Atlanta, went missing from 1979 through 1981. In all, at least 28 young people attached to the case were discovered dead. The Atlanta child murders received saturation coverage in the news media and later spawned a major TV miniseries in 1985. The outcry from such incidents created the so-called missing child movement and eventually led to new legislation. Congress passed the Missing Child Act in 1982 and protocols for dealing with child abduction, including the first nationwide tracking efforts. In the early 1980s, missing children began appearing on milk cartons, an attempt to alert the public to be on the lookout. Missing children also began appearing on pizza boxes and mailers, often with the simple question, "Have you seen me?" In 1983, the year season 1 of Stranger Things takes place, President Ronald Reagan designated the 4-year anniversary of Eden Pance's disappearance, May 25th, as National Missing Children's Day. The next year, the National Center for Missing Children and Exploited Children was created. Meanwhile, each night, just before the local news, a public service announcement intoned, "It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?" The result of all these efforts, ironically, was not a greater sense of security, but a heightened sense of fear and anxiety. As Paula Fuss writes in her book, Kidnapped: Child Abduction in America, eventually as kidnapping rang louder and louder, cultural alarms, and childhood danger, no child was safe. Paradoxically, this is more we know about the crime and more fearsome it becomes, the more addicted we become to the danger it poses for the children we love. It wasn't just kidnapping that gripped parent and public attention in the 1980s either. There were also panics about sexual abuse, daycare facilities, the safety of childhood and playground equipment, the impacts of cable television and music and video games. The list goes on and on. If the bike symbolized childhood freedom, the abandoned bike and Will's disappearance represents this growing fear that something menacing might be lurking just around the corner, ready to snatch up the innocent. Family matters. Will's disappearance, as well as Barb's in Stranger Things, is perfectly in tune with this anxiety-filled zeitgeist. Yet it also demonstrates that parents hadn't quite transformed into the helicopter parents of today. Will is a textbook definition of a latchkey kid. His father, Lonnie, is mostly out of the picture. His mother, Joyce, is a single parent. She works full-time as a retail clerk. She doesn't realize Will is missing until the following morning. Her older son, Jonathan, was supposed to be in charge of him while she worked a late shift. Jonathan was also responsible for waking him up and getting him off to school the next morning. Jonathan, however, was working late too, and assumed Will would be fine with his friends. Such arrangements were not out of the ordinary for families in the 1980s. Divorce rates nearly doubled in the 1960s and 70s. They reached their historical peak in 1981, at which point nearly 50% of all marriages ended in divorce. That meant that a lot of single-parent homes like the Byers. It also meant a lot of latchkey kids like Jonathan and Will. Given the context, it makes sense that Will would come home late from a friend's house by himself, and that he would come back to an empty house. Even when his mother finds him missing, it still seems reasonable that he simply spent the night at the Willers' house. Such lack of supervision wasn't unique to single-parent homes. Even though their house is the friend hub, the Willers' home are frequently in the dark about their kids and their activities and their whereabouts. In the first few episodes, they have no idea that their kids have been playing Dungeons and Dragons for 10 uninterrupted hours. And they have no idea Nancy is dating Steve, or that he sneaks into her room at night. And they have no idea that Will is hiding Eleven in their basement. This isn't to say that they are terrible parents. Karen clearly cares about her children. She consoles Mike when Will goes missing and tries to get Nancy to open up about what's going on in her life in Chapter 3, Holly Jolly. After Nancy spends the night at Steve's house, she pleads with her daughter to be honest with her. "You can talk to me," she says. "You can talk to me." But Nancy, like many teenagers, resists confiding in her mom. Eventually, she does admit that she slept with Steve and that something happened to Barb. However, she keeps most of what she is doing and experiencing over the first 2 seasons secret. That turns out to be quite a bit. The Byers and Willers are families are relatable precisely because of these authentic dynamics. Joyce may not always be there for her kids, but she's trying. She knows people will judge her for Will's disappearance, but rather than dwell on others' perceptions, she goes into overdrive to find him. In Season 1, Chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers, she also acknowledges that she hasn't always been there for Jonathan. "I've been working so hard and I just feel bad," she says. "I barely know what's going on with you. I'm sorry." This absence isn't without context. In the next episode, The Body, we learn that she has worked overtime and holidays to try to make ends meet for the 2 boys. When Will goes missing, she sacrifices everything to find him, refusing to back down when just about everybody around her thinks she's crazy. In Season 1, Chapter 4, The Body, Jonathan acknowledges to Hopper that his mom has struggled with mental health issues in the past. He knows she isn't perfect, but he is mature enough to recognize that or what she's been through and how hard she's tried. "My mom," he tells Hopper, "she's tough." As for the Willers, they are in many ways more dysfunctional than the Byers, a refreshing subversion of stereotypes often associated with single-parent homes versus 2-parent homes. The Willers may be better off financially and eat dinner together, but they struggle just the same. As Matt Duffer explains, yes, they seem like they're the perfect family, but they're certainly not. Ted is far from the best dad ever, and Karen is very overwhelmed. It's almost like there's this facade of a perfect life and a perfect stable family. And I think that's the kind of what Jonathan tries to drive home for Nancy. Nancy knows that her parents' marriage is strained. In fact, she openly questions whether they married for love in the first place. That may or may not be a fair judgment, but there are definitely breakdowns in communication. In Chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers, for example, family dinner quickly deteriorates, causing both Nancy and Mike to storm off to their rooms and prompting Karen to deliver one of the funnier lines of the season. "I hope you're happy enjoying your chicken, Ted." As for Ted, he perfectly embodies the aloof, clueless, conservative, middle-class father. He is not mean or stern, but he is also not very present or perceptive as a husband or father. The most he gets after his kids is with a, kind of like a sports analogy language when someone actually curses. Most of the time when we see him, he is either napping on his recliner, watching TV, or reluctantly answering the door. No wonder Karen is often seen with a glass of wine. When the Hawkins agents descend on the house in Season 1, Chapter 7, The Bathtub, Ted scoffs at the idea that Mike would be hiding 11 in the house. "Our son with a girl," he says. "Believe me, if he had a girl sleeping in this house, we'd know about it." He pauses for a moment, then looks at his wife. "Wouldn't we?" The irony is not only that Mike has in fact been hiding a girl in their basement, or that Nancy has had Steve in her room, but how little he knows about his children in general. This is driven home to comedic effect in Season 2, Chapter 5, Dig Dug, when Dustin drops by. Dustin asks if Mike is home, and as usual, Ted has to ask his wife. Karen, who is on the phone, shouts out that he is at Will's. Dustin then asks if Nancy is there, and Ted again asks his wife, who again shouts that he is at a friend's house. "Our children don't live here anymore," Ted says. "Didn't you know that?" Mike and Nancy then are as much latchkey kids as Will and Jonathan, if not more so. The Wheeler parents may be home more often, but as Ted admits, they know very little about what's actually going on in their kids' lives. Not that Mike and Nancy seem to mind, they've got their own concerns. In the latter half of Season 2, Nancy attempts to discover and expose the secrets of Hawkins' lab with Jonathan, as Mike tries to help Will resist being overcome by the mind flayer. Meanwhile, in the climatic Chapter 9, The Gate, we see Ted asleep in his lazy boy recliner, while Karen is unwinding in a bubble bath, surrounded by candles, reading the kind of mass-market erotic romance novel one might find in the grocery store checkout aisle. Such books were enormously popular among suburban moms in the 1980s, bored by the mundane routines of their day-to-day lives. Karen's temporary escape is memorably disrupted by the doorbell. Her husband, of course, doesn't hear it, over her screaming at him to answer it. So she puts on her bathrobe, rushes downstairs. At the door, it turns out, is chest-bearing, Barone-voiced Billy Hargrove, looking for his sister Max. The sexual tension between Billy and Karen is played up with Mrs. Robinson's style for comedic effect. Billy is like a character torn straight out of the forbidden fantasies of her romance novel, Sexy, Dangerous, Not Ted. Yet, his visit also reminds once again that she and her husband don't have a clue where their children are. If you see Mike, she says to Billy, tell him to come home. Mike and Nancy at this point are together at the Byers house after encountering adventures and dangers their parents could not possibly imagine. Sure, the gap between the kids and parents may be a bit exaggerated, but it's familiar enough to resonate for those who grew up in the era. Parents in the 1980s, for better or worse, simply did not feel obligated to know where their kids were all the time. Being kids. Yet even in Stranger Things, one can sense certain changes emerging. After what happened to her son in Season 1, Joyce becomes much more cautious and protective. In Season 2, she drops Will off at the arcade, rather than allowing him to ride his bike like the other boys. She has Bob take him to school, and she asks Jonathan to accompany him trick-or-treating. Still, even with these efforts to keep a closer eye on him, Will still has quite a bit of freedom. There is no adult watching him at the arcade. He is still allowed to do after-school activities like the AV club, and Jonathan decides to let him go trick-or-treating without supervision. The Byers family, in this way, is fairly representative of the country more broadly in the 1980s. Fears about child safety were growing in the wake of high-profile abductions, but parents were by far and large still allowed their kids quite a bit of latitude compared to today. And for those who were more strict, like Chief Hopper with 11, kids often still found ways to venture outside the purview of their parents or guardians, which is not completely different than parent-child dynamics today. Yet there is an undeniable distance and appeal to the less structured, more adventurous iteration of childhood represented in Stranger Things. There were dangers then as there are dangers now. The show recognizes some of these dangers. Its vision of childhood is not without risks and threats, some familiar, some supernatural. But that childhood freedom, hiding out in forts or for hours, walking down train tracks, exploring scary places, riding bikes alone without grown-ups, is as much part of life in the 1980s as the music or the movies.